Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The security breach that changed everything had been caused by a man named Pilo Was, who was 23 years old, responsible for the third-floor linen rotation in the east wing of the Imperial Palace, and who had, on the evening of the 14th of second month, used his personal communicator to send his mother a recipe for spiced grain pudding while standing in restricted corridor 7 East. He had not meant to destabilize the imperial succession. He had simply wanted to share a recipe. Queen Valëra Sonn learned of the Protocol 7 breach the following morning via a security summary delivered to her console at the 6th hour, sandwiched between a report on atmospheric irregularities above the Delvari colonies and a diplomatic request from the outer territories that she had been diplomatically ignoring for 11 days. She read Pilo Was's name, read the words personal communicator, restricted zone, Protocol 7, and felt the specific, tired resignation of a woman who had written a law 9 years ago in the grip of genuine fear, and was now being governed by it in the grip of genuine inconvenience. The Imperial Security Codex, Section 41, Clause 9. All Protocol 7 breaches shall be subject to a full manual audit of archive surveillance across the affected zone and 12 adjacent sectors, conducted personally by the reigning sovereign, within 72 hours of the triggering event. She had written that clause herself. She remembered writing it. She had been sitting in the war room at 3 in the morning, 17 days after someone had tried to kill her with a device disguised as a potted plant, and she had felt very strongly that no one could be trusted with security oversight except herself. She had been correct at the time. She was paying for it now. The palace kitchens were mid-renovation, which meant that dinner arrived that evening in a vacuum-sealed capsule, printed with the words reconstituted protein harvest, lemon variant, which Valëra ate at her console with the joyless efficiency of a person fueling a machine, while the archived footage from Sector 7 and its 12 adjacent zones began populating her display in a grid of 47 simultaneous feeds. She was wearing her formal evening collar, the stiff architectural construction that rose from her shoulders and framed her face in a silhouette that visiting dignitaries tended to find imposing, and that she privately thought made her look like a particularly authoritative lampshade. Because she had come directly from a state dinner and had not yet had the opportunity to be a human being. A Cathali human being, technically. The distinction mattered to approximately no one outside the 11 orbital territories of the Cathali Empire, and a handful of xenobiologists who corresponded enthusiastically with one another about the bioluminescent traceries that ran along Cathali's skin, which in Valëra's case traced the ridge of her collarbone and the outer edges of her forearms in patterns that brightened when she was calm and dimmed toward invisibility when she was under stress. They had been dim for approximately 6 years. Her eyes, amber over pale violet, moved across 47 feeds with the practiced patience of someone who had long ago accepted that the work of sovereignty was 80% documentation and 20% trying not to let the documentation kill you. The East Corridor footage was exactly what East Corridor footage always was: carts, linens, the slow and purposeful movement of palace staff doing palace things. She found Pilo Was at the 23rd minute of the 4th hour, standing near a supply alcove, looking at his communicator with the expression of a man deeply focused on grain pudding ratios, and felt something close to sympathy for him. He had no idea, none whatsoever. He had sent a recipe and triggered a clause that now had his queen eating lemon protein capsules in a lampshade collar at 10:30 on a Tuesday, and he was almost certainly at home, asleep, dreaming of nothing in particular. She scrubbed through the remaining East Corridor footage in 11 minutes. Nothing. She moved to the adjacent sectors, the consultation annex, the physician's wing, the unmarked corridors connecting the sister residence to the main palace body, and began scrubbing those too with the mechanical focus of a woman who expected to find absolutely nothing and was planning to file the completed audit and go to bed. The room that appeared on no public schematics was listed in the security grid as Auxiliary Storage 7C. This was technically accurate. It was also the kind of accuracy that is indistinguishable from a fiction, maintained by polite agreement since the palace's last architectural renovation, because the room had not stored anything since the previous reign except conversations people needed to have without being seen having them. The recording was 42 days old. The two figures in the low amber light were her sister Lyrian and the royal physician Cauldron Vass, seated close and speaking in the register of people carrying something heavy that they had been carrying for a long time. The audio was clear. The system Valëra had updated in the spring was, as it turned out, extremely good at its job. She did not move for 11 minutes. The security timestamp would later confirm this. In those 11 minutes, her mind attempted, with admirable if futile creativity, to produce alternative interpretations of what she was hearing, rehearsed dialogue, corrupted audio, an elaborate loyalty test she had designed and forgotten, and failed at all of them with quiet, successive finality. The bioluminescent traceries along her forearms flared once, a single brilliant pulse, and then went completely dark. Somewhere in the palace, the automated kitchen unit beeped. Her second lemon capsule was ready. The thing about learning something you cannot unlearn is that the brain, in its first moments of comprehension, makes a genuinely heroic effort to unknow it. Valëra had observed this phenomenon in others, had watched diplomats receive news of collapsed treaties, had watched generals absorb casualty reports, had watched her own council members process information they had not wanted and could not refuse, and had always admired the brief, valiant interval between hearing and accepting, that small corridor of the mind where the self attempts, with full sincerity and zero success, to negotiate with reality. She had never expected to spend 11 minutes living inside that corridor herself, alone in her study at 10:30, with 47 surveillance feeds still open on her console and a lemon protein capsule cooling on the desk beside her. She played the recording again, then again. On the third playback she reduced the volume, as though that might soften the content, which it did not, because the content was not a matter of volume. It was a matter of genetics. Specifically, the near-total absence of hers in the cellular architecture of her daughter, Even. Crown Princess Even Sonn, 22 years old, educated at the Imperial Academy of Statecraft, fluent in 7 languages including the trade dialect of the Outer Rim territories that most imperial scholars considered optional, and even had learned out of what she described as basic professional courtesy, and what Valëra suspected was competitive thoroughness. Even, who had her own opinions about every filing system in the palace and was not shy about sharing them. Even, who had once submitted a 12-page formal memorandum to the head archivist suggesting a complete reorganization of the Imperial Record Index, and had followed it up 3 days later with a revised 14-page version, because she had reconsidered her position on subsections. Even, who had been placed in Valëra's arms in the palace medical wing on a morning 22 years ago that Valëra could still locate in her memory with perfect, unhesitating precision. The particular quality of light in that room, the particular weight of that small and furious person, the particular sensation of understanding, for the first time, that something existed which she would burn 11 worlds to protect. The succession codex of the Cathali Empire was 4,000 years old and had been amended 97 times, and in all of those amendments, across all of those centuries, not one revision had ever touched the genetic lineage clause. The clause was older than 3 of the languages it had originally been written in. It was older than 6 of the 11 orbital territories Valëra currently governed. It had the immovable quality of a thing that had existed long enough to stop being a rule and become simply a fact, like gravity, or the tendency of state dinners to run 40 minutes longer than scheduled, or the certainty that any piece of legislation written at 3 in the morning under emotional duress would spend the next decade making its author regret it. According to that clause, even had no legal claim to the throne. Valëra stood up. She did this in the way that a person stands up when their body has made the decision independently of the rest of them, the legs simply executing while the mind is still mid-argument. She walked to the window. The capital city of Keth Prime spread below her in the low aurora glow that the planet's magnetosphere produced every evening between the 9th and 14th hours, a phenomenon that the tourism documentation described as hauntingly beautiful and that Valëra had always privately thought looked like the sky was attempting to troubleshoot itself. The city was quiet, 11 billion people sleeping, or working night rotations, or arguing in low voices in domestic spaces about small things that felt enormous, none of them aware that the queen of their empire was standing at a window, in a lampshade collar with her bioluminescent traceries completely dark, trying to decide what kind of catastrophe she was about to cause, and whether there was any version of the available options that was not, in some fundamental way, devastating. She could do nothing. This was technically an option. She had learned the information from a recording she had made in a room that most people did not know existed, which meant that the information's existence was entirely within her control. She could seal the archive, update the system settings, go to bed, eat breakfast in the morning, real breakfast. Eventually, once the renovation was finished and the kitchen stopped producing lemon capsules, and simply continue. Raise even. Prepare even for the throne. Transmit the empire to someone who was ready to receive it, by every measure except one that was 4,000 years old and had never been asked to account for the administrative failures of a fertility clinic. This option had the considerable advantage of not destroying anything. It had the considerable disadvantage of requiring Valëra to govern, for the remainder of her reign, with a secret she now shared involuntarily with her sister and her physician, neither of whom knew she knew it, all three of them in possession of the same information and none of them, technically, in conversation about it. She could confront Lyrian. She could confront Cauldron Vass. She could convene the Imperial Legal Council, at which point privacy would cease to exist entirely, because there was no configuration of lawyers and legal questions in which information remained contained. Lawyers, in Valëra's long experience, were to confidentiality what thermal fusion ovens were to nitrogen. Theoretically compatible and practically combustible, she could go to even right now, walk down the corridor, knock on the door, say what precisely. The sentence did not complete itself no matter how many times she approached it. The automated kitchen unit beeped again. A cheerful, indifferent sound, designed by some engineer somewhere who had never been queen, indicating that her protein capsule had reached optimal consumption temperature. Lemon variant. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that if she was going to dismantle the succession of an empire that had stood for 4,000 years, she deserved at minimum a hot meal first. She also thought, immediately after, that she had written the very law preventing her from delegating the audit that had led her here, and that her past self had an enormous amount to answer for, and that if time travel were ever invented, she intended to use it exclusively to go back and have a word with herself at 3 in the morning in the war room 9 years ago. Just a brief word, mostly about the clause. Valëra had summoned people to her private study under difficult circumstances before. She had called generals there to deliver news of failed campaigns. She had called council members there to explain votes they had cast against her wishes. She had once called the head of the Imperial Cartography Division there to explain, personally and at length, why a map of the Delvari orbital territories had been published with 2 of the moons labeled in the wrong order, which was not, strictly speaking, a crisis, but which had offended Valëra's sense of institutional precision so thoroughly that it had felt like one. She knew, therefore, the specific texture of walking into this room when the Queen was already seated and waiting. She knew what it meant that the chair behind the desk was occupied before you had been invited to sit. She knew what it meant that the thermal brew on the desk was being held in both hands, with both hands very still. She had engineered this atmosphere on other people's behalf many times. It was, she reflected, considerably less enjoyable from the other side of the desk. Cauldron Vass arrived first. This was because Valëra had summoned him 5 minutes ahead of Lyrian, which was a deliberate choice she had made at 2 in the morning while unable to sleep. A period of wakefulness that had also produced a list of 17 things she wanted to say, a counter list of 11 things she should not say, and the firm conclusion that she needed to see his face before her sister's face. Because Cauldron Vass had the quality of a man whose expressions told the truth slightly ahead of his words. He came in with the careful movement of someone who had read the summons twice and was still hoping it meant something other than what it meant. He sat in the chair she indicated. He looked at her. His expression told the truth immediately and without delay, which confirmed what she had suspected. He knew that she knew, or he knew that something had changed, or he knew at minimum that this was not a routine morning consultation, and the knowing had arranged itself across his face with the helpless clarity of text on a display screen. Lyrian arrived at the 7th hour precisely. She was, among her many qualities, a person of exact punctuality, which Valëra had always admired and which now, this morning, had the quality of a small kindness, the mercy of not being made to wait. Lyrian walked through the door and stopped walking. She looked at her sister. She looked at Cauldron Vass. She looked at her sister again. And then she did something that Valëra had not fully anticipated. She did not attempt to arrange her face. She simply let it be what it was, which was the face of someone who has spent a long time preparing for a moment, and has arrived at it to find that preparation and arrival are entirely different experiences. She sat down without being invited. There were perhaps 4 people in the Empire who could sit in this room without an invitation, and Lyrian was one of them by virtue of a relationship that preceded the Empire itself, or at least preceded Valëra's administration of it, and that no protocol had ever successfully governed. She sat, and she was quiet, and the automated atmospheric system cycled through a full humidity adjustment in the silence, because the palace's environmental controls had been installed by people who apparently felt that if silence was going to exist, it should at least be comfortable. Valëra set down her thermal brew with the deliberate precision of someone placing the first piece of evidence on a table. She said, in the voice she used for formal addresses to the Imperial Council, which she was using now not because this was formal, but because it was the voice that did not shake, that she had completed her security audit of Sector 7 and the 12 adjacent zones, that the audio capture system in Auxiliary Storage 7C had been updated in the spring and had been operating at full capacity for 90 days, that she was therefore wondering whether either of them had anything they wished to tell her, and that she was asking as a courtesy, because she was aware this was not information they had intended her to have, and she paused here, because this was the part of the 17 things she had written at 2 in the morning that she had also put on the counter list. She was trying to begin this conversation in a register that left room for all of them to remain in the same room by the end of it. The silence after this was long enough that Cauldron Vass made a careful, preparatory sound, the kind that precedes speech by someone who is organizing their words with great professional caution. Lyrian stopped him with a raised hand. She did this without looking at him, which meant she did it from memory, from the practiced authority of a woman who had been stopping people from speaking at the wrong moment for her entire adult life. Then she looked at Valëra and said, I have been trying to tell you for 6 years. Valëra had prepared for several openings. She had prepared for denial, for deflection, for the specific form of elaborate calm that guilty people deploy when they have had time to rehearse. She had not prepared for her sister's face in this moment, which was not the face of someone defending a position, but the face of someone who had finally, after a very long time, set something down. Lyrian told her the shape of it without embellishment. She had found the genetic analysis in a routine archive update when Even was 16. A background reconciliation of the palace medical records, triggered automatically by a system upgrade, had flagged an inconsistency that no one had thought to bury because no one had imagined anyone would ever look. She had gone to Cauldron Vass because she needed confirmation that what she was reading. Cauldron Vass, who had apparently decided that the era of Lyrian's raised hand was concluded, said quietly that the original clinic director had died 8 years prior, that the 3 technicians involved carried no knowledge of what had followed from their error, and that the only documentation of the mismatch existed in a sealed medical archive that he alone maintained, and that the imperial legal system had never had cause to query. He said this with the precision of a man who had rehearsed it, and Valëra recognized the rehearsal not as deception, but as the opposite, as the careful preparation of someone who had always known this moment would come and had wanted to be accurate when it did. Valëra looked at them both for a long moment. Outside the study window, the morning aurora had faded, and the Keth Prime sky was doing its usual transition into the pale gray gold of early governance hours, the color the city turned when the night shift ended and the day shift began, and 11 billion people exchanged one set of concerns for another without ever knowing that anything above them had changed. She said, "You spent 6 years deciding whether to tell me, and the conclusion you arrived at was to have the conversation in a room you believed was not recording." Cauldron Vass made a sound that was not quite anything describable. Lyrian closed her eyes. "To be fair," Lyrian said, "that room has not been recording for the past 11 years. Valëra looked at the ceiling in the way that she looked at the ceiling when she was exercising a very specific form of patience. "I updated the system in the spring," she said. There was a silence of a different quality than the ones before it. Then Lyrian opened her eyes and said, very quietly, that she owed Valëra an apology for the 6 years, and that she understood if the apology was not sufficient, and that she was offering it anyway because it was the only thing she had that was entirely her own to give. And Valëra looked at her sister who had stood beside her at every coronation ritual, every state funeral, every diplomatic dinner from which neither of them had ever been allowed to simply leave, and felt several things simultaneously, which was inconvenient because she had only prepared to feel one of them. The automated kitchen unit in the adjoining room beeped once. A third lemon capsule. Cauldron Vass glanced involuntarily in the direction of the sound, and then back at the Queen with the expression of a man deeply regretting the timing of automated systems in moments of imperial consequence. Valëra thought that she would eventually find this funny. Not today, but eventually. She did not sleep. This was not unusual. Valëra had spent the better part of her reign conducting important thinking between the hours of midnight and 5, which her personal aide had long ago stopped trying to prevent, and had instead accommodated by ensuring the study was always lit, and the thermal brew unit always stocked. A small institutional surrender that Valëra found more comforting than she had ever admitted to anyone. What was unusual was that she was not, this night, thinking about the problem. She had finished thinking about the problem sometime around the 2nd hour of morning, at which point the thinking had resolved itself into something that was not quite a decision and not quite a certainty, but was closer to both than anything she had managed in the preceding 17 hours since the study confrontation. What she was doing instead in the low quiet of the imperial residence at 3 in the morning was sitting beside her daughter's door. Not inside. She had not knocked. She was simply sitting in the corridor outside Even's apartments in a chair she had carried from her own room, which had involved navigating a palace hallway with a piece of furniture at 2:30 in the morning. An act of such profound informality that it would have horrified every protocol officer she employed. She was wearing civilian clothes for the first time in what she calculated was approximately 11 days. No collar, no formal construction of any kind. She looked, she suspected, like someone's mother, which was precisely what she was, and which was the thing she needed to remember more clearly than she had allowed herself to remember it in the past 17 hours of thinking about succession law. The Imperial Legal Council convened at the 9th hour on the following morning. Valëra arrived exactly on time, which was itself a message, because queens who arrived exactly on time were queens who had somewhere else they intended to be. She sat at the head of the table and looked at 7 council members who were performing various degrees of senatorial composure, and she told them, without preamble, that she was commissioning a revision to the succession codex, specifically to the genetic lineage clause, specifically to the provision that recognized genetic relation as the sole sufficient basis for succession rights, which she proposed replacing with language establishing a dual pathway. Genetic lineage, or a minimum of 15 years of documented sovereign cultivation, defined as formal preparation for imperial rule conducted under the direct authority of the reigning monarch, verified by the council itself, and recorded in the Imperial Succession Archive. She had written the proposed revision herself at 4 in the morning, longhand, on actual paper, because the document felt like something that should exist first in a physical form, in her own hand, before it became a legal instrument. The paper was currently in her interior pocket. She was aware that carrying handwritten succession law revisions in one's pocket was not standard governmental procedure. She was also aware that she had, at 3 in the morning, carried a chair down a palace hallway, and that the bar for her sense of procedural dignity had already cleared some distance. The council members began speaking. All 7 of them had things to say, which was expected, because they were lawyers, and lawyers in Valëra's experience were constitutionally incapable of receiving information in silence. She let them speak. She let them cite precedents and raise procedural objections, and invoke the names of 4 dead queens whose positions on the matter were, she noted privately, not directly quotable on account of those queens being dead, and therefore unavailable for clarification. She let the room work through the argument as it needed to work through it, because she was not trying to override the council. She was trying to change a law which required the council's understanding as well as its vote, and understanding took time. The eldest member of the council was a woman named Sira And, who had served under 3 queens of the House of Sonn, and who had once told Valëra in the first year of her reign, without particular warmth, that she would reserve her opinion of this administration for the moment it was tested by something that could not be solved with intelligence alone. She had been waiting 9 years for that test. She looked at the proposed revision, and she looked at the queen who had written it in longhand at 4 in the morning, after a night spent in a corridor chair outside her daughter's room. And she said that in 3 decades of service to the Cathali throne, she had watched sovereigns make decisions from fear, from ambition, from calculation, from pride, and from the particular paralysis that comes from loving power more than the people it is supposed to serve. She said she had not, until this morning, watched one make a decision from the direction she was currently observing. She did not name the direction. She did not need to. The vote was 5-2. The revision passed into provisional status, pending a full codex review, which under imperial legal procedure would take 60 days, and which would become permanent at the end of those 60 days, unless contested by a supermajority of the territorial governors, which Valëra assessed as unlikely given that she governed 11 territories, and intended to have a personal conversation with each of their governors before the week was out. She filed the provisional order. She signed the documentation. She thanked the council with the formal courtesy of a queen who has just done something irrevocable and is at peace with it, which is a different quality of thanks than any other kind and which Sira And, at least, appeared to recognize. Then she walked out of the chamber and down the long corridor that connected the governmental wing to the residential palace, through 3 security checkpoints that waved her through with the slightly stunned efficiency of guards who could tell something had shifted but could not yet name what. And she did not stop until she was standing again outside Evan's door. She knocked. There was a pause. then the sound of something being set down, a data tablet probably, or one of the 12 physical star charts even maintained in various states of annotation, despite the existence of perfectly adequate digital alternatives. A habit she defended by arguing that physical interaction with spatial data produced cognitive engagement that screen-based systems could not replicate, and that Valëra had privately suspected, since Even was 14, was simply because she liked maps. The door opened. Even was holding a stylus and wearing the expression she wore when she had been concentrating deeply, and had not yet fully returned from whatever interior space concentration took her to. She looked at her mother, and the expression shifted into something more present, and then into something more careful, because Even was perceptive in the way that people are perceptive when they have spent 22 years paying close attention to a single person, and have learned all of that person's registers. "Are you all right?" she said. Valëra considered this question with the full weight it deserved. She thought about a recording 42 days old. She thought about Lyrian's face when she had finally set something down. She thought about a 4,000-year-old clause, and the morning she had spent revising it in longhand, and the vote that had changed what the law said love was allowed to mean in the governance of an empire. She thought about a man named Pilo Was, who had sent his mother a recipe for spiced grain pudding, and had accidentally put all of this in motion, and who was almost certainly still unaware of it, and who deserved, at minimum, some form of commendation that she would need to figure out how to phrase. "There is something I need to tell you," Valëra said. "It is complicated and it is going to require us to sit down, and I would like very much before any of it for someone to find us actual food. Not capsules, real food. Whatever they have in the interim kitchen. Anything that does not say lemon variant on the packaging." Even stared at her for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and opened it wider, which was an answer of the kind that does not require words, and Valëra walked inside. The bioluminescent traceries along her forearms, which had been dark for 6 years and darker still for the past 2 days, had begun, faintly, unevenly, in the way